Welcome to the Wade Center Podcast,
a podcast of Wheaton College.
Welcome back to the Wade Center Podcast. I'm Jim Beitler, the director of the Marion E. Wade Center, here once again with Aaron Hill. Welcome to you, Aaron.
Hey, Jim. How are you?
Good. And we are just absolutely thrilled today to have on the show Simon Horobin, professor of English language and literature and fellow and tutor at Magdalen College in Oxford. And if you're thinking that sounds a little bit similar to C.S. Lewis and his position, you wouldn't be totally wrong. So Simon works where Lewis worked, and he teaches similar things. So Simon, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And we want to talk about your book, which is C.S. Lewis's Oxford, which was published by Bodleian Library Publishing. But before we get to that, tell our listeners a little bit more about your background. How did you become a professor? And my goodness, what's it like to teach at Magdalen College in Oxford?
Yeah, very wonderful experience, I have to say. I've been here nearly 20 years, and I still find most days as I walk in and see the beautiful surroundings, I'm overwhelmed by just what a privilege it is actually to be here. And to teach such brilliant students, that's another great privilege of the job. And you say that, I'm in a similar position to C.S. Lewis, and that's right. Although it's worth remembering that in those days, Lewis taught whole English curriculum. And thankfully, I have two other colleagues. So I only have to teach up to 1550.
Okay.
We then have, someone else who comes in and does the Renaissance, and then we have another person who does the modern period. And I guess it was a bit different in Lewis's day because they only went up to 1830. So
right.
Contemporary literature wasn't really a thing. But even so, he did teach extremely widely. And of course, he also taught philosophy here, and he taught political theory to the historians. So, I'm in awe of just how broad his knowledge was and the amount of teaching hours that he did.
And not just kind of in session in tutorials, but as I was reading your book, I was just struck again by how, especially in the 1920s, how busy his nights were.
Yeah.
He was meeting with so many different groups at the time. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's right. I was really struck by that because we all know about the Inklings, for instance. And, I wasn't surprised that there were other kinds of societies going on, but he was doing it every single night and often till very late. Beer and Beowulf, he would say, I'd be clearing away the tankards at 11:30. But he says, it's part of the job is to get to know the students outside the teaching hour. So, I think he just thought that was very much part of the job. And it's fair to say that, of course, he did live in college. So that even when he bought the Kilns in 1930, he would still probably sleep in his college rooms most nights during the week, during term time. But even so, that's still giving up a lot of your time to those kinds of activities. The Linguistics Society, the Mermaid Group that read Elizabethan drama. It was constant.
Cave. There was a group called
Cave. Yeah, exactly. The Michaelmas Club that he set up, which was a kind of philosophical and literary reading group, which he did because when he arrived, he found that there were very few societies in college for students to attend. So it was part of what he felt the college should be about. So he was pretty energetic in actually establishing these things.
There were a few things that struck me. I'm already getting into the book. I can't help myself. But there were a few things that struck me, just how different things are now than they were then. And one was just how cold it would have been in his living quarters at the time. You wrote at one point about the glass of water on his, nightstand would have frozen over, or he talked about that at times, and the mice as well.
Yeah, it was quite primitive. I mean, it still gets pretty cold in some of these buildings around college now, I can tell you. So in fact, one of my colleagues was complaining at lunchtime today about being in a corner room in the cloisters with the wind outside. So actually, even now in May, it's still quite cold. But of course, in Lewis's day, it was that the only heating he had in these rooms was because I'm actually sitting in the new building right now on staircase 5. He was staircase 3. But the only form of heating was the log fire. After the war, the coal was rationed and the fires were few, and it certainly was a pretty Spartan experience. Beautiful surroundings, but
yes.
The actual living conditions were quite primitive.
Speaking of the surroundings, you mentioned at one point, you're of course talking about Addison's Walk. Addison's Walk comes up at one point, and there's a poem by Lewis about Addison's Walk, and that's in the book. And that was a treat to read again. So thank you for including that. And then thinking about the animals that were there, the deer, of course, and it just seems like an idyllic setting.
Yeah, I mean, and when you think that you've actually just come off the busy Oxford High Street, and then you step into a world where quite quickly you feel like you're in the middle of the countryside. And, the deer park, which, sort of over the back of the new buildings overlooks. And so you look out your window and there are the deer and you don't hear the traffic or, you feel like you're in Narnia to some degree, I suppose.
Yeah. It seemed like when Lewis arrived in Oxford for the first time, well, he had this kind of profound experience when he got off the train. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, this his first encounter with Oxford?
Yeah, sure. So this is when he's coming to sit the scholarship exams. So it's his sort of first time in Oxford, but also it's a very important moment for him. His whole Oxford career kind of rests on it. And he tells the story about how he came out of the station into the city centre, prepared for what he was going to be greeted by, these beautiful historic buildings, and starts walking and wondering why he's not seen any yet. And in fact, the further he goes, the more and more confused and disappointed he becomes, until he realizes that he's come out of the station and turned the wrong way, and he's actually walking through the rather unprepossessing modern Botley suburbs. And it's only when he gets to the top of the hill, turns round and sees that he then is greeted with this spectacular view of the Oxford skyline. And it's interesting when he's writing about that in Surprised by Joy, that he seems to see that as a kind of allegory of his life, that sort of his conversion, the turning around, and that Oxford then becomes quite a symbolic city, I think. And so that was obviously quite an important moment for him, because the disappointment is suddenly replaced by this incredible sense of the beauty of the place.
Simon, tell us a little bit more about yourself and kind of your biography, how you ended up at Oxford, before we really get into some of the stories in the book.
Well, I guess my interest in medieval literature goes back to my school days, where I had a teacher who was very keen to introduce us to things like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So I already had a kind of hankering to read more of that kind of poetry, especially it was the language that appealed to me. And so I continued to study that when I was at university, did my PhD on Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and then became an academic myself. I worked at the University of Glasgow for a number of years and then came to Oxford in 2006. And I've been teaching in this post ever since. And I suppose my first encounter with Lewis was as a child, reading the Narnia stories. But then as a student, reading The Discarded Image was the book that I began with. It was just so helpful.
Yes.
I mean, in the way that generations of Oxford students benefited from those lectures, which is what that book is comprised of. So it was just such a helpful introduction, survey of the whole period. And The Allegory of Love was another one that I read around that same time. And then I kind of got into Lewis, more and more. And particularly when I came to Magdalen, because I remember the C.S. Lewis Society wrote to me shortly after that and said, as you're, at Magdalen now as a medieval English person, we'd love you to come and speak to us about C.S. Lewis. And I remember writing back and saying, I don't really know that much about C.S. Lewis. And then I realized that was bad and I should remedy it. And partly just simply being here in the college and around, the things that sort of, the memories of Lewis, the pictures of him and the archival material made me just get more and more interested and more keen to find out more.
Was that discovery process, was that what led you to end up writing the book? Was just this desire to learn more about it? And then like most people, when you start researching, you just kind of end up, going down a rabbit hole. Is that how the genesis of the book, or was there some other thing that led to it?
That's right. Well, there's a couple of other things. One was that I wanted to do an exhibition about Lewis here in the library, bringing together all these archival materials, and some of which, there are pictures of in the book, and some of which I talk about. And so I began doing the research for that and planning that. And that was when the Bodleian then said, well, why don't you make a book out of that as well? And in fact, in the end, the exhibition had to be postponed because of the COVID pandemic. And at the same time, as we started to come out of the pandemic, there was that period where here in the UK, certainly, you could meet in small groups outside, and you couldn't meet your students inside and have actual seminars and things. So one of the things I started doing was doing tours of Oxford in which I talked about C.S. Lewis, because it was a sort of way of getting people together and talking about things I was interested in. And so actually, the book sort of reads a bit like a tour of Oxford, partly because that was how it began. It was just an interesting way of talking about Lewis and other things with students in small groups.
That's one of the things that struck me when I was reading it, is that I just want to take the book to Oxford and then go from place to place and then encounter these wonderful vignettes about different figures. And then also the images, as you were saying, really add a lot in the middle section of the book there. They're just great. And there's even one image that is of the wardrobe here at the Marion E. Wade Center, which made me very happy to see that included as well. So that was really great. Simon, the book starts, the first chapter after the preface, which is about Lewis kind of encountering Oxford for the first time, is Lewis at University College. And one of the things that just struck me about this chapter was how many times Lewis failed, how many things he applied for, fellowships that he ultimately didn't get. He did win an essay contest, and I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, this kind of early experience with trying to get a job, essentially.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, one of the first things I put into the exhibition that we had at Magdalen from our archives is the rejection letter that he got from the president when he applied for a research fellowship here. That was one of the first posts that he applied for. And the president says he did well, but not quite well enough. And actually, although when you see the list because actually in the president's notebook, I also found a list of all the people who had applied for it. And they were a really distinguished bunch. I mean, one of them went on to become the Regius Professor of Greek and so on. He was up against some tough competition. But yeah, it is kind of a salutary reminder that it was a challenging and competitive world. And the other thing that's interesting, I think, about that is that he was at that point setting out to become an academic philosopher. Mm-hmm. And so it would have been a very different Lewis. I sometimes wonder what would it have been if he'd got that tutorial fellowship at Trinity that he was interviewed for instance, in philosophy. And it's the one where in his diary he gives us a nice account of the dinner before the interviews, which was a famously difficult process of being interviewed, where the senior tutor gets very drunk and indiscreet. But, what would it have been like if he'd actually got that job? We wouldn't associate him with Magdalen, obviously, but also would he have done all the kind of literary scholarship that he went on to do? Mm-hmm. And it was really only because of those failures that he decided, with the advice of his philosophy tutor at UNIV, to do the English course, because it was a practical decision, because there were more jobs in English, because it was a relatively new subject. And it was the first tutorial fellowship in English that the college advertised in 1925 that he successfully applied for. And of course, the experience of having been rejected for the philosophy fellowship here, I think, was part of that, because there was obviously an implication in what the president was saying, was that he had thought highly of his application.
Yeah. It's just so fascinating. And as I was reading that account, I was thinking of our own undergraduates and as they set out after college, and how those first couple of years after college can be tough. And I almost thought about assigning it to them as just a reminder that even C.S. Lewis had difficulty at the beginning of his career getting a job.
Well, and I mean, that's not even to say anything of his dreams of being a poet and dimer. And, he didn't exactly nail it right out of the gate in career-wise.
You mentioned that the book reads a little bit like a walking tour. And I wonder if we might just go on a walking tour with you on the podcast. So, all right. So first stop on our walking tour, we've talked about it a little bit already, is Magdalen College. Is it something from Magdalen College that you would want to tell us if we were there?
Well, one of the places I stop when I'm touring people around the college is right outside the new building, because you can stand there and look up at the rooms that Lewis occupied. There are 3 windows at the front of the building, and those are the study and the bedroom. And of course, it's there that I usually then read the passage from Surprised by Joy, where he says, you must picture me in that room in Magdalen night after night. And so that moment of his conversion to theism, that where he's wrestling, and the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. And that's pretty special, I think, just to see exactly where that took place. But if I can have a bit more, I would then go down onto Addison's Walk and then walk down to Holywell Ford, which is where the plaque with that poem that you mentioned on Addison's Walk is, by the gates, and then talk about that conversation that he has with Hugo Dyson and J.R.R. Tolkien in September 1931. It takes him slightly longer to then accept Christianity, but that, of course, is a conversation that happens on Addison's Walk, where they're sort of pacing around, and then they go back to his rooms and stay there till 2 a.m. talking about Christianity and myths and so on. And that's such a significant moment in his biography, and of course it's also important for his friendship with Tolkien and his understanding of myth, which is so central to so much of what he wrote. So those, I think, are probably the key locations in Magdalen.
Another one that stood out to me is Oscar. Is it the Oscar Wilde room?
Yeah.
Where he had a lunch, I think, with Pauline Baynes.
Yeah.
And so he had encountered her illustrations through Tolkien's work, and so he invited her to have lunch in the Oscar Wilde room.
Yeah, which was pretty important for that relationship and for the Narnia stories too, isn't it? Yeah. And that's a wonderful room anyway, because it's got this huge portrait of Oscar Wilde in it. It's called that because it was Oscar Wilde's room when he was a student, and it has scratched into the window pane a picture that Oscar Wilde sort of carved of one of his friends at the time.
Wow.
Which is quite a nice little legacy.
Wow.
If you guys aren't careful at Oxford, every room could turn into some sort of museum over time.
That's right, exactly. Yeah.
All right. So the next stop on our tour takes us a little outside of Oxford proper to Headington.
Yeah, that's an interesting area, of course, because, the obvious location is the Kilns, where he moved in 1930. But, of course, he did spend quite a lot of time in the early period of his life, while he was still a student, living in bedsits with Mrs. Moore and her daughter Maureen, in what was a pretty sort of grotty and run-down part of Oxford in those days. So he spent quite a lot of time in Headington. But of course, that's where the Kilns is, where he lived then and bought the house and then really lived there for the rest of his life. And of course, that's a wonderful location to visit, because although it's had to be redeveloped a lot since Lewis's time, it now looks very, very like, sort of reconstructed to look very like it was when Lewis himself was there. So you can sit in his sort of study upstairs and look out over the garden and think about when he wrote the Narnia stories.
Yeah, and this is just a pitch for our listeners to buy the book, because there's a lot of interesting details there surrounding the Kilns, including like what Warney thought of the Kilns and evacuees during the war who stayed with Lewis at the Kilns. Just fascinating stuff.
Yeah, that's such an interesting moment, isn't it? Because, it's so puzzling why Lewis, at that particular moment in his life, should decide to write a fairy story, as he says he did. In his 40s, he's a bachelor, he's got no children, but yet he suddenly decided to write a book for children. And the fact that it begins with four children being evacuated from London to live with an absent-minded old professor in a big rambling house in the countryside surely has something to do with those 4 children coming to the Kilns. And he writes very warmly about them to his friends. I never really appreciated children until the war brought them to me. So and I loved all the details I discovered about just how many animals there were living in the Kilns.
Yes.
Wow.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
With his pet swans and
He clearly loved animals.
He was a great animal lover. Yeah.
You mentioned his love specifically for dogs.
Yeah. And there's that lovely passage in Surprised by Joy about the terrier Tim, isn't there? About how he never did anything that you told him to. He sometimes agreed with you.
Okay, so Eagle and Child. Most of our listeners are probably familiar with that one. Anything from the Eagle and Child that we should observe when we're there?
The sad thing is, of course, it's closed.
Right.
So that's and has been ever since 2020. But there are still promises of it reopening, and I can't believe that it won't, because it's just such an important sort of landmark, and so many people you see walking past it and sort of pressing their noses up against the window panes trying to see the rabbit room. But one of the things I hadn't really grasped about it was that the room that became the rabbit room, where they met, was actually initially just the landlord's sitting room. And that there was a special arrangement they had with him, because they were such regulars, that he would let them use his front room just to have their sort of drinking sessions in. And then subsequently that was knocked through to become part of the main pub. But that connection with the landlord and with the Oxford of old, Warney writes very touchingly about it when the landlord dies in the mid-1940s and says, he was such a good connection with the days when students would wrestle with the landlord over the cost of the drinks. And, you sort of gives you a real window into what that world was like. But of course it was, it was another just very important meeting space for them on a regular basis. And they carried on meeting there, for a very long time. Although there was a period where they go over the road to the Lamb and Flag, partly because of when, during the war, the American soldiers that were stationed in Oxford had drunk the Eagle and Child dry. And so there was no more beer there. So they had to reluctantly cross the road.
Okay, let's move on from the Eagle and Child to the Eastgate Hotel.
Yeah, that's another interesting location. It's sort of, in the book, I talk about two important meeting points there, because the first is the fact that because it was sort of equidistant between Merton College and Magdalen, Lewis and Tolkien used to meet there regularly. And so it's an interesting location for their developing friendship. And there are lovely letters that Tolkien sends to his son Christopher during the war when he's off training with the RAF in South Africa. And he talks about having read chunks of various bits of The Lord of the Rings to Lewis whilst in the Eastgate Hotel. I do sometimes wonder what the other punters made of all of this, but it's an amazing thing to imagine. And then Lewis read to him chapters from The Great Divorce. And Tolkien says, and I didn't think much of that, but Lewis was moved to tears by my book. But yeah, so that it's very important for their friendship, but it's also very important because it's where Lewis first met Joy Davidman when she finally sort of came to Oxford. Obviously, they'd been corresponding for a while, and their first meeting was also in the Eastgate Hotel. So I think that's an important moment for his sort of later biography, and of course it also has something of an impact on the friendship with Tolkien as well. Lewis didn't mention to him about their marriage and things, and I think that did put a bit of a wedge between them.
Yeah. Somerville College.
So that's not going to be so well known, I think, to listeners as a location to associate with Lewis. But the reason there is a chapter about that principally is because of its association with the Socratic Club, which again, we talked about how busy he is on an evening during term time. And of course, every Monday night at 8 p.m, he was presiding over the Socratic Club, which was it was a group that was formed by the chaplain to women students at the university during the Second World War. She'd been approached by some undergraduates saying that there were lots of groups that met to discuss Christianity, but they all assumed that you were Christian, and they were interested in having some kind of a group for people who were just interested in finding out about the faith from the outside. And so she decided to have a first meeting in Somerville College, which was one of the women's colleges, and she put up a poster saying, calling all atheists, come to this meeting, and got a huge turnout. And there was clearly a big interest in this. And so she set up this Socratic Club to meet at the beginning of 1942. And any group that meets in the university needs, by the university statutes, to have a senior member. And so she decided to ask C.S. Lewis, because of him being, a recent convert who was also, becoming a very well-known apologist, because sort of 1942 is also the year of Screw Tape and the BBC broadcasts and so on. And he'd already written the Problem of Pain. And that was obviously an inspired suggestion of hers, because he then presided over those meetings. In fact, he did it continually until he left for Cambridge. So, that's nearly 30 years. And what they did was essentially present some sort of topic for debate, like the relationship between science and religion, say, and then you'd have a speaker coming to talk about it from the atheist perspective, and then one from the Christian perspective, and then there'd be a debate which Lewis would himself oversee. And quite often he was the speaker from the Christian perspective. And these were, again, incredibly well attended. That was one of the things I discovered reading through. There are meticulous minutes kept at all these meetings that are still archived in the Bodleian. And you really get a sense of just how many people were there and what a really kind of vibrant atmosphere and debate it was.
You mentioned that C.S. Lewis left for Cambridge, and our listeners probably know that at the end of his life, Lewis went to a different Magdalen College in Cambridge. And there's a moment in the book where at least I got the sense that it was bittersweet in terms of, he says at one point, or writes at one point, that he didn't want to give up his keys to Magdalen, to the bursar, because he couldn't imagine essentially living without the grounds of Magdalen College, or something to that effect.
Yeah, I think he says an Adders-less life or something, because Adders was the sort of affectionate name for Addison's Walk.
C.S. Lewis loved Oxford. You get that sense from the first time he's there. He writes this poem. It's idyllic. I'm sure there were things about Oxford he didn't like. So maybe that's the first part of the question. What about Oxford did C.S. Lewis not like? And the second question is, did Oxford love C.S. Lewis back?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, isn't it? And part of the answer to that is, of course, the fact that he went to Cambridge. And that's partly because Oxford didn't ever offer him a chair. So, that's a sort of professorial appointment. And in those days, to become an Oxford professor required a chair to be vacated. And when they were vacated, he was never elected to them. And so in a sense, I think it didn't recognise him as much as he deserved. And at the time, Cambridge spotted an opportunity and created a chair that was obviously expressly intended to be for him. I mean, it's the chair of medieval and Renaissance English, which he was sort of uniquely qualified to hold, and they just offered it to him. So, in that sense, I think, Oxford didn't honour him in the way that it might have done, and that was really why he ended up leaving. But I think that's sort of that Oxford of his day. I think Oxford recognises him much more so today than it did. Although, one of the things I was sort of keen to do was to kind of promote Lewis's legacy, particularly in the university, where it's somewhat, I suspect, slightly less well recognised than it is sort of popularly. And then the first question was about...
Were there parts of the Oxford life that Lewis did not like? So, I'm thinking of a passage where he writes to his father early on, and he says, I think it's after he arrives at Magdalen, and he says, "I scarcely can believe my good fortune." Essentially, I'm paraphrasing. But were there aspects of living in Oxford that he did not like at all?
Well, one answer to that might be committees and administration.
I had the same thought. I thought, just go read that Hideous Strength and you'll see what he thinks about it.
No, that's perfect. Yeah, that college meeting. You know exactly where he's got that from. And of course, there's that bit in the book about the disastrous year that he spent as the vice president of the college, in which he was responsible for the organisation of all of the college committees and overseeing all the meetings and booking all the events, and just made a complete mess of the whole thing. And to be fair to him, that's the year. It was the same year in which he was also going all over the country delivering talks at RAF bases, 1941. So he was extraordinarily busy. And again, it sort of links to all the screw tape letters. And, that was an incredibly busy period for Lewis as he's becoming really a very public apologist. And he saw that as his war work, and that took precedence, really. But also, as he would, I'm sure, have freely admitted, he had no interest in committees. It wasn't his thing at all. And he was sort of known for just sort of drifting off during meetings, or, writing letters to people, or, thinking about something else. So I suspect college administration, it would have been one of those. He also didn't like the way that the sort of car factory in the area near Headington was sort of expanding out, and the amount of traffic that was on the streets, and the way that lots of small houses were being built all around, the kind of urbanization of the city. I mean, where he lives on the Kilns was really the middle of the countryside to begin with, but now we think of it as very much, the ring road just runs right by his house, and that huge garden that he had with the big lake and so on, it must have felt very rural. But even during his time in the sort of 50s, that was changing a lot. Tolkien complained about that too. He says when he lived on Holywell Street, which is now pedestrianised, but in those days he said he called it Mordor in our midst, because there was just so much traffic coming to and fro.
Well, thank you. This tour is almost done. We have been to many of the sites in the book. The book ends with 3 chapters: St. Mary's Passage, Cambridge, and Global Lewis. Maybe we'll leave off Cambridge and Global Lewis for readers to discover themselves. But what about St. Mary's Passage?
Well, that's probably the best known stop on any tourist route. And often when I take people there to talk about it, there's already a group there having the sort of standard tour experience. But my take on it is slightly different. But this is the doorway that has 2 gilded fawns sort of carved by the side of it, and what seems to be a lion's head carved in the middle of the wooden door. And then when you turn to the right, there's this old-fashioned lamppost. And the story is, of course, that when Lewis came out of St. Mary's, the University Church, opposite, on a very snowy winter's night, he was confronted by, these fawns, which gave him the idea for Mr. Tumnus, and then Aslan the lion, and then turned to his right, and there was the lamppost from Lantern Waste. And all these ideas kind of sort of coalesced into the opening scene of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And you can see why everyone takes their tour guests there, because it's such a perfect story. But the reality is, as I'm sure you know, that Lewis himself, when he gave an account of where he got the idea from, he said he began with seeing pictures in his head, including one of a fawn standing in a snowy wood holding some brown paper packages. And that was when he was in his teens. So it predates him actually coming to Oxford. I essentially have to go there and just tell the story and then pour cold water all over it. Which, is a bit unfortunate. But I think one of the things I find interesting, and this is sort of where the book ends up in a way, is that, the Oxford that we know today, and it comes back to this question about, does Oxford recognise C.S. Lewis? I think the Oxford today, is influenced by the books themselves. So we're going around looking for Narnia because we're all, we want to connect with the place itself. It may not be that that's where he got the idea from, but Oxford has now been transformed in some senses by Lewis's legacy. We put up a big lamppost in college in about 10 years ago. And it's very much exactly the same kind of model as that you find in Lantern Waste, because, we want to connect with that story as much as anyone. And in fact, there are umpteen lampposts around Oxford that are suggested to be the model, because we all want to connect with it. It's like Lewis says about reading fairy stories. It shouldn't be just about escapism. It should also be about trying to make the real world a little bit enchanted. You don't read about enchanted woods so that all the other woods seem really drab, rather the opposite. And I think that's it. He's sort of enchanted Oxford for us. And so we go around trying to look for those points of contact.
Well, thank you. This has just been an absolutely wonderful time talking with you about your amazing book. Again, I hope readers will check it out. There's a lot more there on this walking tour to discover. Simon, what are you working on now? What's next?
Well, there's a very obvious sequel to this book that you can probably already guess what it is and what it's called. J.R.R. Tolkien's Oxford.
My goodness.
Hey, I saw the philology in your title and I thought, well, maybe this is a conversation we have with Simon in the future.
Wow. Well, listeners, stay tuned for part 2 when that book comes out. That's very exciting. And Simon, thank you again for your time.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to meet you.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.